There is a building on the western edge of a town called Carrow Bay that has a sign above its door. The sign is painted timber, dark green background. It reads Post Office. The lettering was done by hand in 1923 by a man named Seamus Coyne, who charged 4 shillings for the work and considered it slightly underpaid. He said the O's were particularly difficult. If you look closely at the word post, the O leans slightly to the left, as if it has been standing in coastal wind for a long time and has simply given up trying to stay straight. It has been standing in coastal wind for a long time. The building itself is limestone. 2 stories, though only the ground floor ever functioned as a post office. The upper floor was a flat where the postmaster lived for 31 years. The walls are thick, nearly 2 feet at the base, because the people who built limestone buildings on the west coast of Ireland in the early 20th century understood something about patience. They built things to outlast the reasons for building them. The postmark for Carrow Bay reads Cuan Cara in Irish. It means friendly harbor. The bay itself is not particularly friendly. It is gray most of the year and produces a specific quality of horizontal rain that local people describe not as rain falling, but as rain arriving, as if it has been traveling from somewhere else and this is simply where it decided to stop. We are going to spend some time here tonight. There is no rush. Carrow Bay sits on the coast of County Galway, approximately 43 kilometers from the nearest town of any size. The road that connects it to that town was widened in 1978 and then largely forgotten by the county council, which is a pattern that repeats itself in this story with some regularity. At its peak in the census of 1962, Carrow Bay had a population of 412 people. The current population, depending on how you count, seasonal residents and one man who splits his time between here and a flat in Galway City, but considers Carrow Bay his home in a way he cannot fully explain, is somewhere between 9 and 11. The post office is still open. This is the part that takes some explaining. The postmaster of Carrow Bay for the last 26 years of its active operation was a man named Michael Folan. He was born in the town in 1951, the second of 4 children in a house that no longer stands about 300 meters from the water. His father was a fisherman. His mother kept accounts for 2 of the local shops, both of which closed before Michael was 40. Michael took over the post office in 1993 from a woman named Bridie Shaughnessy, who had run it since 1971 and who retired at the age of 74 with what she described as considerable relief and not a moment of regret. She handed Michael the keys on a Tuesday morning in February. There were 3 keys on the ring. 1 for the front door, 1 for the back room where the parcels were stored, and 1 small brass key that opened a locked drawer in the counter. When Michael finally used it, the drawer contained nothing except a 1967 Irish penny and a folded note. The note read, "The radiator takes 20 minutes to warm up." That has described the post office as it looked in its working years. You entered through a door with a bell above it. The bell was not decorative. It was a functional bell on a spring mechanism, and it rang with a specific sound, not a clean ding, but something slightly flatter, more of a thunk, with a tail. Michael could hear it from the back room and from upstairs, and, on quiet days, from the small garden behind the building where he sometimes ate his lunch. He knew by the sound of the bell whether the door had been opened quickly or slowly. A quick open meant someone in a hurry. A slow open usually meant Mrs. Connolly from the cottages up the hill, who had bad knees and opened doors carefully. The floor inside was quarry tile in a dark red that had faded unevenly over the decades, so that the path from the door to the counter, the path most walked, was noticeably paler than the rest of the floor. If you looked at it in the right light, you could see exactly where 100,000 pairs of feet had gone, a record of every visit pressed slowly into the stone. The counter was solid oak, waist height, with a section of lower counter on the left side that had been installed sometime in the 1980s, the logic of which no one could quite remember. There was a glass partition that had been added during a renovation in 2001, a requirement from in post the National Postal Service, which Michael found unnecessary and faintly insulting, given that he knew everyone who came through the door by name. But he installed it without complaint and simply spoke slightly louder through it. Behind the counter, shelves of sorted post, rubber bands in a ceramic pot that had originally been a mustard jar, a second ceramic pot matching containing pens, a calendar that was always 1 month behind because Michael preferred to turn the pages when the month was already over, when he knew how it had gone, a black telephone push button but old enough to predate mobile phones by a decade, which rang perhaps twice a week in the later years and almost exclusively when it was in post calling to ask about numbers. On the wall behind the shelves, a framed photograph of the town taken in 1974 from the hill above the bay. In the photograph you can see the rooftops of 41 buildings. In the present day, 11 of those buildings are still standing. Of those 11, 3 are occupied. The photograph is not labeled. Michael did not need labels. The public side of the counter had a single wooden bench against the wall. It seated 3 people comfortably. It rarely needed 2. In the later years, most days passed with fewer than 4 customers. Some days none, and Michael sorted the post and restocked the small rack of envelopes and padded bags near the door and listened to the radio, which sat on a shelf near the back and was tuned to Galway Bay FM, and which he turned on every morning at 8:45 and turned off every evening when he locked up. He liked the weather reports most. He already knew the weather. He had known the weather in Carrow Bay his entire life, with the kind of knowledge that does not come from forecasts. But he liked hearing someone describe it formally. Rain moving in from the Atlantic, winds southwesterly, 15 to 20 knots, temperatures remaining below seasonal average. He found it calming, the idea that someone was paying attention to it officially. The question people sometimes ask, the few people who know about Michael Folan and the post office of Carrow Bay, is why he kept going. The official answer is that he kept going because the post office was officially open, and post had not closed it. The volume of mail had dropped to a level that most organizations would consider grounds for closure, but the formal decision had not been made. And until it was, the post office was open, and if it was open, someone had to be there to open it. That is the official answer, and it is accurate as far as it goes. The less official answer is more complicated and has to do with the specific nature of staying somewhere after most of the reasons for staying have quietly left without making a fuss about it. Carrow Bay was, for most of its history, a fishing community. Not a large one, not a famous one. It did not have the kind of dramatic history that gets written down and put in books. It had the kind of history that gets remembered by the people who lived it, and then, when those people are gone, is mostly gone with them. The bay itself is shaped like a thumb bent slightly at the knuckle. The opening faces northwest, which is where the weather comes from, which is why the houses were built on the eastern and southern sides of the bay, tucked slightly behind the headland. This was not a conscious decision made by one person at one time. It was a series of decisions made by a number of people over a number of generations, each one building where the previous ones had found it reasonable to build, which is how most towns actually come to exist if you look carefully. Enough at the geography. At the height of its activity in the decades between the 1920s and the 1960s, Carrow Bay had a post office, a general store, a hardware shop, a pub called Malachy's, named for its founder, not any subsequent owner, all of whom also answered to Malachy by tradition and mild confusion. A small primary school with 2 classrooms, a pier, a lifeboat station staffed by volunteers, a small church that held services 3 times a week, and a hall that was used for dances and occasional town meetings, and once a production of a 1-act play that the participants remembered as either a triumph or a disaster depending on who you asked and how many years had passed. By the time Michael Folan took over the post office in 1993, the hardware shop was already gone. The general store was in its final years. The school had closed in 1988 when the last enrolled children moved away with their families, and the building had stood empty since then, which is a specific kind of emptiness that is different from the emptiness of a building that was never used. It holds the faint residue of chalk and small coats on hooks and the sound of children learning to read in a language that most of them would later use mainly for filling in official forms. Malachy's pub was still open in 1993. It would remain open until 2011 when the 4th Malachy to run it retired, and found in looking around for someone to take it on that there was no one left to take it on. The church held its last regular service in 2009. It still stands, the door is unlocked. Someone, no one knows exactly who, puts fresh flowers in the stone font near the entrance every few weeks. The flowers are always the same, 3 stems of something wild, yellow or white, the kind of thing that grows on the headland without any encouragement. The pier is still there. The lifeboat station is still there, though the boat itself was relocated to a station in a larger town in 2004. The empty boat rack sits in the station like a sentence that ends in the middle. Michael Folan sorted the mail every morning at 8 o'clock. This is worth describing because the sorting of mail in a small post office is a particular kind of work that no longer exists in most places and is worth recording while someone still remembers doing it. The mail arrived in the later years 3 days a week, in the earlier years 6, in a gray plastic crate delivered by a van from the sorting office in Galway. The van arrived between 7:30 and 8, depending on the road conditions and the mood of the driver, who was for many years a man named Padraig, who drove with one hand and ate his breakfast with the other, and who greeted Michael each morning with the same phrase, "Anything strange?" to which Michael consistently replied, "Not a thing," which became over the years less of an exchange of information and more of a small ritual that meant something like, "I see you, and this day is beginning, and that is enough." Michael sorted the mail into pigeonholes on a wooden rack behind the counter. Each pigeonhole had a name written on a small card slotted into a holder at the front. In the early years of his tenure, there were 47 pigeonholes. By 2015, he had removed 31 of them, the names belonging to people who had moved away or died or both. And the remaining 16 stood in a row with gaps between them, where the others had been, like missing teeth, like the spaces in the town itself. He knew the handwriting on most of the letters. This sounds like an exaggeration, but it is not. In a community of a few hundred people receiving mail from a relatively consistent set of senders, patterns repeat. He could tell you that the letters from Dublin that came for Caitlin Naughton were always written by someone with a leftward slant and a habit of underlining words for emphasis. He did not read the letters, this is worth saying clearly. He never opened a letter that was not his, but he handled them, held them, sorted them, carried them, and in that handling accumulated a kind of knowledge about the lives in the town that was wordless and complete. The way a doctor knows a patient not just from charts, but from something harder to name, the last registered letter received at Carrow Bay Post Office arrived on March 14, 2019. It was addressed to a woman named Nora Keane, who had lived in the town her entire life and who was, at the time of the letter's arrival, 81 years old. The letter was from the land registry in Dublin. It concerned a small strip of land behind her property, a boundary query that had apparently been pending since 1987, which is a particular kind of bureaucratic patience that is impressive in its own way. Michael brought it to her house himself that afternoon, as he did with all registered letters. He walked up the hill behind the town on a road that was more accurately described as a track, a distance of about 600 meters, carrying the letter in the inside pocket of his jacket because the weather was the usual weather and he didn't want the envelope to get wet. Nora Keane answered the door on the second knock, which she always did. She had a policy about knocking. 1 knock was an accident, 2 was intentional, 3 was urgent. She dealt with things in that order. She looked at the letter for a moment, and then at Michael, and then at the letter again, and said something that translated from the Irish as, 32 years for a bit of land the cows haven't used since Fianna Fáil were popular. She then invited him in for tea, which he accepted, and they sat in her kitchen for 40 minutes talking about nothing in particular. The weather, a program on the radio the previous evening, the state of the road on the hill, and then he walked back down to the post office and turned the sign to Claude, and that was that day done. Let us talk about the regulars, because every post office has them, and the regulars of Carrow Bay were particular people worth spending time with. There was Nora Keane, who we have already met. She came in every Thursday, which was the day her magazine arrived. The magazine was a weekly publication about Irish country life, gardens, recipes, small stories about rural communities. She had subscribed since 1974, which meant she had subscribed through the decline of the post office, through the decline of the town, through the decades of departures and closures and changes, and had continued to receive the same magazine in the same format about the same kinds of things, a thread of continuity that ran through all of it, like a line you could hold on to. She always read the letters page first. She had opinions about the letters page that she shared with Michael on those Thursday visits with some energy, not angry opinions, just specific ones. There was Tomás Og Diran, who was called Tomás Og, young Tomás, to distinguish him from his father, who had been Tomás Moore, Big Tomás, who had died in 1998, but whose nickname had left a shape in the language that his son still fit. Tomás Og was in his 60s by the time the post office reached its quieter years. He came in for his pension every second Tuesday, which he received in cash because he did not trust banks and said so clearly when anyone raised the subject. He counted the notes on the counter with the focused attention of a man for whom money was not abstract. He never found an error. Michael never made one. Tomas Og had a dog named Kara, Friendly, who he brought everywhere and who was not technically allowed inside the post office, but who Michael permitted because the alternative was Tomas, Og tying the dog to the drain pipe outside, and the drain pipe was already in a fragile condition and the dog was not small. Carrow would lie on the quarry tiles while Tomas Og conducted his business and would periodically tap her tail against the floor in a rhythm that had nothing to do with anything happening around her, as if she was keeping time with some internal music. There was Siobhan Faherty, who was the youngest of the regulars at 54, which tells you something about the demographics of what remained. Siobhan had come back to the town 10 years earlier to look after her mother, who had since died and had stayed partly from inertia and partly from a complicated feeling about the town that she described when pressed as, "I keep meaning to leave and then I don't." She came in for parcels mostly. She ordered things online, books mainly, sometimes clothes, with a regularity that kept a small but consistent stream of parcels moving through the post office in its final years. Michael sometimes thought that Siobhan Faherty's book orders alone justified the existence of a postal system serving Carrow Bay. She always looked at the return addresses on the parcels. She could tell you which online retailers were actually located in which countries based on their return addresses, and she had strong views about logistics chains that Michael found detailed and interesting. There was Father Brendan Connolly, who was not actually a priest but had been called Father Brendan by everyone since childhood because he had briefly considered the priesthood at 17 and then had not considered it at all since, but the name had settled on him like weather and he had stopped correcting people sometime in his 30s. He came in once a week on no consistent day, sent one letter, never received any, and paid for everything in coins that he counted out slowly from a leather pouch that was older than some buildings in the town. He never said where the letters were going. Michael never asked. There are things that small post offices hold in confidence, not because of any formal policy, but because the people running them understand that privacy has value, and that the value of privacy increases in proportion to how well everyone around you knows your business. In 2019, N Post conducted a review of rural post offices. This was not unusual. Reviews had been conducted periodically for 2 decades, each one finding that rural post offices were economically marginal, and each one concluding that they provided important community services and should be maintained, which is a kind of institutional indecision that has a long tradition in Irish public life. The 2019 review found what all the previous reviews had found, with the additional observation that the volume of mail in certain designated rural areas had declined to the point where maintenance was difficult to justify on purely operational grounds. The language of the report was careful and measured and used phrases like challenging sustainability profile and long-term structural pressures. That meant something simpler and more direct when translated. Michael received a letter from N Post in July of 2019. He noted, with the professional habit of 30 years, the font used on the envelope, the weight of the paper inside, the way the letter had been folded once vertically, not into thirds as most formal letters were, and then he read it. The letter informed him that his post office was among those under review for operational rationalization. It offered a consultation process. It outlined the timeline. It used the phrase community impact assessment 4 times. He read it twice. He put it under the counter in the place where he put things that required thought. He served the next customer, who was Tomas Og collecting his pension, and did not mention the letter. Then he locked up at 5:30, walked up the stairs to his flat, and made himself something to eat. He slept fine, which surprised him slightly when he thought about it later. The consultation process lasted 4 months. Michael attended 2 of the 3 scheduled meetings. The third was held in Galway City on a Wednesday, and he didn't go because Wednesday was mail day, and he wasn't going to leave the post office unmanned on mail day for a meeting about closing the post office, which struck him as a specific kind of irony he didn't need to experience in person. At the first meeting, he brought a folder of records he had kept over the years, not because N Post had asked for them, but because he thought they were relevant and because he was the kind of person who thought records mattered. The folder contained the delivery logs from the previous 5 years, a handwritten list of services provided beyond standard mail operations, a list of the 14 times he had called emergency services on behalf of residents who did not have phones or whose phones were not working, and a one-page document he had written himself which did not use any formal language, and which said in its plainest version that the post office was the last public building in Carrow Bay that was open 5 days a week, and that this fact meant something, and that he was not sure the review was accounting for what it meant. The person chairing the first meeting listened to him carefully and wrote things in a notebook. She had the air of someone who had attended many of these meetings and who genuinely respected the people at them, even while understanding that the outcome was largely predetermined, which is a difficult position to occupy, and she occupied it with grace. Michael drove home after the first meeting on a road that was dark by the time he reached the part where the streetlights ended. And the sea was somewhere in the black to his left, present but invisible. He turned the radio on, rain overnight, clearing by morning. He already knew that. The formal decision arrived in a second letter, 6 weeks after the consultation process closed. It was a Thursday. Nora Keane's magazine had arrived that morning, which Michael had placed in her pigeonhole as usual at 8:15. He opened the letter at 8:23. The letter confirmed that Carrow Bay Post Office would cease operations on the 31st of January the following year. It thanked him for his participation in the consultation process and wished him well in his future endeavors. He folded it once vertically and put it in the same place he had put the first letter. Between the date of that letter and the 31st of January, there were 88 working days. He knew this because he counted them that same evening, sitting at the kitchen table upstairs with a calendar and a pen. 88 felt like a number he could work with. He did not tell the regulars immediately. He told them in the order that felt right, which was not chronological and which he could not have explained if asked. He told Father Brendan first, because Father Brendan had been coming the longest and because Michael thought he would take it with the most equanimity. Father Brendan was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's a pity. It'll be felt," and then he bought his stamp, counted his coins from the leather pouch and left. He told Siobhan Ferretti second. She stood at the counter for a longer moment than the others would, and then said, "Where am I supposed to go for parcels?" which was not a question about parcels. He told Tomas Ogue on a Tuesday, which was pension day, because he thought it was better to tell him when the routine was present as a kind of anchor. Tomas Ogue said nothing for long enough that Michael wondered if he had heard. And then Tomas Ogue said, "Where'll I bring Cara?" to which there was no good answer. He told Nora last, on a Thursday after her magazine had arrived. She looked at him for a moment and then looked at the magazine and then back at him. She said, "I've been coming in here since before you were born," which was true. Her first visit to the post office had been in 1961, when she was 4 years old, to buy a stamp with her mother. She could not remember what the stamp was for. She remembered the smell of the place, warm paper and ink, and something she had never been able to identify exactly. Michael said he thought it might be the lino under the front mat, which was original to the building and which did have a particular smell if the weather was damp. Nora said she thought he might be right, and then she took her magazine and went home. The question of Tomas Ogue's pension was a practical one that required solving. The nearest alternative post office was in a town called Clogmore, 14 kilometers away. Tomas Ogue did not drive. He had not driven since 2014, when his eyesight had changed in a way that he described as not suitable for the road, and which he had accepted with characteristic practicality. He had walked the 2 kilometers to the post office every second Tuesday for the previous 9 years. 14 kilometers was not something he could walk every second Tuesday at his age, and with his knees, which he described as adequate for the terrain available, Michael spent 3 afternoons working through the options with him. They established that the pension could be paid directly into a bank account, which Tomas Ogue did not have, and which he maintained he did not want. They established that a family member could collect on his behalf. He had a niece in Galway who said she would come every second Tuesday, who he then called once a week to check she had not forgotten, which she found touching and only slightly exhausting. Michael helped him open a basic bank account anyway, in case the niece arrangement became complicated, which was a thing he did not say out loud, but which both of them understood. The account was in Tomas Ogue's name and held, for the first 6 months, exactly the amount of his first pension payment and nothing else. A journalist came from Galway in October. She had heard about the post office through someone who had heard about it through someone else, and she wanted to write a piece about it. Michael was polite to her, which he was by temperament, and answered her questions, which he did because he had thought about what he wanted said and what he did not. He told her about the delivery logs, the 14 emergency calls, the pension arrangement. He told her about the regulars in general terms that did not identify anyone specifically. He showed her the pigeonholes with their 16 remaining names. She photographed them. He did not show her the 2 letters under the counter. The piece was published in a regional newspaper 3 weeks later. It was not sensational. It described things accurately. He kept a copy in the folder under the counter. Not for sentiment, he told himself. Nora's magazine arrived every Thursday through December. The last one arrived on the 26th, which was a Thursday and also the day after Christmas, which meant the post office was open when many other things were not. Nora came in at her usual time, collected her magazine, read 3 letters on the letters page in what Michael interpreted as a mood of particular engagement. She stayed for 40 minutes. She did not mention that it was the last December issue she would collect from this address. He did not mention it either. It was understood. January came the way January usually came to Carrow Bay, with rain and a particular kind of gray that was different from the gray of other months. A horizontal gray, people there would tell you, that came in off the water and had a weight to it that vertical rain didn't have. Michael opened the post office every day in January that it was scheduled to be open. He sorted the mail, which by January had reduced to a volume that he could sort in under 15 minutes. He served the customers who came, who in January were fewer than usual because January in Carrow Bay kept people inside where the horizontal gray could not reach them. He kept the radio on, which he always had, because the silence of a post office with no customers is a different kind of silence from a comfortable one. He watered the plant on the windowsill, which was a spider plant he had had for 11 years, and which had survived on the approximate amount of attention he gave it, which was not very much. The plant did not seem to know that anything was ending. The last week was an ordinary week in most of the ways that weeks are measured. The mail came 3 days, the radio played. The spider plant received approximately the same amount of attention as it always had, which was not very much. He cleaned the counter on the Tuesday, which he did every Tuesday. He refilled the rubber band dispenser on the Wednesday, which he had been doing for 26 years, and which would not need refilling again. He did not make a ceremony of this. Thursday the 29th was Nora's last Thursday. Her magazine arrived. She collected it. She read 4 letters on the letters page, which was one more than usual. She stayed for 55 minutes. Before she left, she said, "You've run a good shop, Michael." To which he said thank you and meant it completely. The door closed. Her Thursday magazine was the last magazine he ever put in that pigeonhole. January 31st fell on a Friday. He set his alarm for 6:45, as he always did on mail days. He made his breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, tea in the white mug with a chip on the handle that he had meant to replace for several years. He ate at the kitchen table with the radio on. At 7:30 he went downstairs and unlocked the post office. He turned on the lights. The mail arrived at 7:51, 8 letters, 2 small parcels. He sorted them into the remaining 16 pigeonholes, which took 9 minutes. Padraig, the van driver, said nothing unusual when he handed over the crate. Then at the door he turned back and said, "Mind yourself, Michael," which is a phrase that means several things at once in the way that certain phrases do when they have been used for long enough. Father Brendan came at 9:15, which was earlier than he usually came. He bought a stamp. He counted his coins from the leather pouch. He did not say anything different from what he usually said. At the door he paused the same way he had paused the Thursday before. And then he left and the door closed, and that was the last time Father Brendan Connolly would come to this post office. Tomas Ogue arrived at 10. Cara came in and lay on the quarry tiles and tapped her tail 7 times in her own rhythm and then went still, as if she also understood, which she almost certainly did not, but which is the kind of thought that occurs to people in rooms where things are ending. Tomas Ogue did not collect his pension on this visit because his pension had already been transferred. He came to come. That was the whole reason. They talked for 20 minutes about nothing that either of them would have been able to repeat accurately afterwards. The road up to the old school, whether the lifeboat station building might be taken on by someone for something. At the door Tomas Ogue stopped and looked at the space for a long moment. And then he said Cara's name once, quietly, and the dog got up from the tiles and walked to the door. Sivan Faherty came at 11:30 with a parcel to return. She had ordered it 3 weeks earlier specifically, so she would have something to return on this day, which he understood without her saying so. She stood at the counter while he processed the return, and they talked about a book she had received the previous week, a novel set in Lisbon that she recommended with specific enthusiasm. He wrote the title down on a piece of paper. At the door she said, "I keep meaning to leave, and then I don't. I think that's going to keep being true." And she left, and the door closed, and the post office was quiet. There were no more customers after Siobhan Faherty. The last transaction of Carrow Bay Post Office was a parcel return processed at 11:47 on the 31st of January. He worked through the afternoon. There was paperwork associated with closing a post office, forms to complete, accounts to reconcile, an inventory of equipment and fixtures to submit. He completed it all by 4 o'clock, which he considered a reasonable pace given the volume. He put the completed forms in the envelope provided by N Post for this purpose, sealed it, and placed it in the outgoing mail. At 4:30 he walked through the post office one time, slowly, which he had not planned to do, and which he did anyway. He ran his hand along the oak counter. He looked at the pigeonholes. He looked at the bench where the regular sat, which had a different grain on the left end from years of the same hands, resting in the same place. He looked at the spider plant. Then he went to the door. He turned the sign from open to close at 4:47. He locked the door. He stood for a moment with his hand on the door. Then he went upstairs. He made himself something to eat. He watched something on the television. He went to bed at a reasonable hour. The post office was closed. The sign said so. The lock confirmed it. The dark window on the ground floor was visible from the street. In the weeks after the 31st of January, several things happened in the order that things tend to happen after endings. Nora Keane's magazine was redirected to a newsagent in Clogmore, 14 kilometers away, which did not have a pigeonhole for her. It was left on the counter with her name on a post-it note, which she found adequate but not the same. She drove herself to collect it on the first Thursday and on the second Thursday, and then she arranged a standing order for delivery to her house, which began on the third Thursday. The delivery arrived at a different time each week, which was not what she was used to, but which she accepted. Father Brendan drove to Clogmore on the first Friday after the closure to buy his stamp. The Clogmore post office was larger, brighter, and had a queue management system with a ticket dispenser. He took a ticket. He bought his stamp. He continued to write his weekly letter. The letter continued to go wherever it went. Siobhan Faherty drove to Clogmore for her parcels, which she had always known she would have to do, and which she did without complaint, though not without an opinion. Her opinion was that the closure had been a bureaucratic decision made by people who had never visited Carrow Bay, and who had no particular interest in whether anyone there could receive a parcel. She expressed this opinion to several people, none of whom disagreed with her. Tomas Ogg's niece arrived on the second Tuesday of February to take him to Clogmore to collect his pension. He had called her on the Monday to confirm she was coming, which she was, and which she had always been going to be. He brought Cara in the car, which the niece had expected, and which she had no objection to. The journey took 19 minutes. Tomas Ogg noted this. On the drive home he said that it was not as bad as he had expected, which was the most positive assessment he was likely to give of anything he had not chosen. Michael Folan did not immediately know what to do with himself in the days after the closure. This was not depression, which he was careful to note to himself. It was more like the feeling of having left a light on in a room you were no longer in. He took long walks, which he had always done but now did at different times, because the morning walk had previously been structured around the mail delivery. He read the novel Siobhan had recommended. He thought it was very good. He watered the spider plant, which had been moved upstairs after the closure, and which continued to receive approximately the same amount of attention. It always had. It was in mid-February that he discovered the paperwork. He had been going through his files, not for any specific reason, but in the way that a person goes through files when they find themselves with more time than they are used to. The form in question was a Form DS-11, which was the form required to formally register the closure of a post office with the relevant regulatory authority. It had been included in the closure pack sent by N Post, along with the other forms he had completed and returned. But this form, unlike the others, had not been completed by Michael. It had not been completed because it had not been required to be completed by Michael. It was supposed to be filed by the regional N Post office, not the postmaster, and as far as Michael could determine, having spent 2 afternoons looking into it, it had not been filed. which meant as far as the regulatory record was concerned that Carrow Bay post office had never been formally closed. It was still, on paper, open. Michael sat with this information for 3 days. On the 4th day he went downstairs, unlocked the front door, and turned the sign from closed to open. He was not sure this was the right thing to do. He did it anyway. He did not tell anyone he had reopened. The first person to notice was Thomas Ogue, who walked past on a Thursday morning, not a Tuesday, because the pension arrangement was now in Clogmore, and saw the light on inside. Michael opened the door. Thomas Ogue came in. Carrow went to the tiles. Her tail tapped 7 times in her own rhythm. Michael made tea. They talked for 40 minutes about nothing and several things. Word reached Nora the following Thursday, which was the day she came in to see for herself. She did not bring her magazine, because her magazine now came to the house, which was a different arrangement and which she had adapted to and which she was not going to change. But she stayed for an hour and read 3 letters on the letters page of a magazine she found on the bench, which someone had left there. Father Brendan came in on the following Friday. He bought a stamp. He counted his coins from the leather pouch. He did not comment on the reopening, neither did Michael. Suvan Faherty came on a Wednesday and ordered a parcel to be sent. She did not order the parcel specifically to have a reason to come in. It was a parcel that needed sending anyway. She told Michael about the book set in Lisbon, which he had now read, and they discussed it for 11 minutes. The post office did not return to its previous volume of activity. The mail delivery had ceased with the closure. There was no mail to sort. What remained was a place where people could come. Michael opened the door at 8:30 each morning and closed it at 4:30 each afternoon. He kept the radio on. He kept the rubber bands in the ceramic pot, which he refilled as needed, though less often than before. And Post was informed of the oversight regarding the DS-11 form in March of that year, in a letter from Michael that was precise, polite, and notable for the complete absence of any suggestion about what should be done about it, and Post acknowledged receipt of the letter. Nothing further happened on the regulatory question for 14 months. During those 14 months, the post office in Carrow Bay remained open. The regulars came when they came. The spider plant continued to receive approximately the same amount of attention it always had, which was not very much, and which was apparently enough. The second summer came the way summers come to the west coast of Ireland, tentatively and with frequent apologies. There were good days in July, 3 of them consecutively, during which Thomas Ogue sat on the bench outside the post office with Cara and watched the bay. He did this without particular comment, which was how he did most things. On the second of those 3 days, Nora Keane brought a folding chair from her house and sat beside him for an hour and 40 minutes. Neither of them spoke for most of it, which suited both of them and which was not uncomfortable. The researcher arrived in August. Her name was Dr. She was a lecturer in cultural geography at University College, Galway, and she was writing a paper on the persistence of informal community infrastructure in post-decline rural settlements, which is to say, she was writing about places like Carrow Bay and buildings like this one. She had contacted Michael by letter 3 weeks earlier, which he had appreciated, as it was the kind of thing that should be done by letter. She spent 4 days in Carrow Bay. She stayed in a farmhouse 2 kilometers outside the village that took guests 3 months of the year. On the first morning she came to the post office at 9 o'clock and sat on the bench inside and asked Michael questions for 2 hours. He answered them in the order they were asked, which was also the order that made the most sense to him, and which suggested to her that he had thought about these things before. She asked him why he had reopened. He said that the paperwork had not been filed, which meant it was still technically open, which meant he could open it. She wrote this down. Then she looked up and waited. He said that he had also reopened because the post office had been in this building since 1923, and because the building without the post office in it was a different kind of building, and he was not sure what kind. She wrote this down too. On the second morning she walked the whole village, which took 40 minutes, and photographed the buildings. Of the 23 buildings in the village proper, 11 were occupied year-round, 5 were used seasonally, 4 were empty but structurally sound, and 3 were in various stages of returning to the landscape. The post office was the only building in the village with a function that required it to be open to anyone who came. She noted this in her paper as the distinction between private persistence and public persistence. On the third day she interviewed Nora Keane, who had agreed to speak with her on condition that her full name not appear in any published work, which Effie agreed to. Nora spoke for an hour and 20 minutes. She addressed her remarks to a point somewhere above Aoife's left shoulder, which was how she spoke to people she did not know well. She described the post office as a place where things were received and sent, which Aoife thought was a more precise description than anything she had written in the paper so far. On the fourth day, Aoife came to the post office at opening time and spent the morning sitting on the bench and observing. Not much happened. Tomas Og came in with Cara. Michael made tea. They talked about the forecast. Before she left, Aoife shook Michael's hand and said that she hoped the regulatory question resolved itself in a way that was satisfactory, to which Michael said he appreciated that and meant it. The paper was published the following spring in a journal called Rural Geographies. Michael received a copy in the post. He read it twice and filed it in the folder under the counter. By autumn of the second year, the regulars had settled into a rhythm that was different from the original rhythm, but which had its own consistency. Nora came on Thursdays, which she always had, but arrived later than before because the magazine came to the house now, and there was no specific reason for the earlier time. She stayed the same amount of time she always had, which suggested the timing of arrival was incidental, and the duration was the thing. Father Brendan continued to come on Fridays. He bought stamps even in weeks when he had no letter to send. Michael did not comment on this. It was not his business what the stamps were for. Case001 Fairty came irregularly but often, which was also how she read books in bursts of sustained attention separated by stretches of other things. She and Michael had by this point discussed 11 books between them, of which they had agreed on 8 and disagreed on 3. The 3 they disagreed on they discussed more than the 8 they agreed on, which was as it should be. Tomas Og came on Thursdays too, which meant he and Nora were often there at the same time, which neither of them had planned and both of them had, in their own way, arranged. Cara had a favorite spot on the quarry tiles that was approximately 14 inches to the left of where she had always lain, which she had shifted to gradually over the course of the first winter without anyone noticing when exactly the shift had happened. Michael noticed it one morning in February of the second year and found it difficult to explain why he found it moving. In the mornings, before opening, Michael had developed a habit of standing at the post office window and looking out at the bay for approximately 5 minutes. He had not done this before the closure. It was something that had begun in the weeks after, when he had more time than he was used to, and which had persisted. He thought about various things during those 5 minutes, which is to say he thought about whatever presented itself, which varied. On some mornings he thought about the mail, the years of it, the weight of a full delivery crate versus the weight at the end. On some mornings he thought about individual letters, not their contents but their physical presence, their envelopes, the handwriting on the outside. He had handled a great many letters in 30 years. He thought it was probably in the hundreds of thousands, though he had never tried to calculate it exactly. On other mornings he thought about the regulars, not with worry, but with something more like the feeling of checking that things were in their correct places. He thought about Nora's Thursday timing, which had shifted by 40 minutes over the course of 2 years, and which he could track with some accuracy, because he always noticed when she arrived. He thought about Father Brendan's stamps, which were accumulating somewhere in a drawer or a box in the presbytery unused. Or perhaps they were being used, he had no way of knowing. He thought about that too. On the mornings when he thought about nothing in particular, which were the majority of mornings, he looked at the bay. The bay changed every day in ways that were small and difficult to describe, but which meant that looking at it each morning was not the same as looking at it the morning before. He had been looking at this bay his whole life. At 8:30 he turned from the window and unlocked the door. He turned the sign from closed to open. He switched on the radio, and the post office was open again, as it had been open on every working day for 96 years, with one interruption of indeterminate length, depending on how you counted. He went behind the counter and waited to see who would come. The week in question was the second week of October in the third year of the post office's reopened operation. It was an ordinary week in almost every respect, which is why it is worth describing. On Monday the post office was open and no one came. Michael read for 2 hours in the afternoon, which was something he had started doing on quiet days because it was better than looking at the clock. On Tuesday, Siobhan Faraday came in at 11:10 with a parcel to send to her sister in Cork, and they discussed a novel she had finished the previous evening. The novel was one they had previously disagreed about in principle, but which she had now read, and which had changed her position, which she acknowledged with the particular grace of someone who changes their mind well. He said he was glad she had read it. He meant it entirely. On Wednesday a parcel arrived that was addressed to a woman named Bridget Keneally. Michael did not recognize the name immediately, which was unusual for a village of this size, and which made him look more carefully. Then he did recognize it. Bridget Keneally had lived in Carrow Bay from her birth in 1951 until her emigration to England in 1973, when she was 22. She had not lived in Carrow Bay for 50 years. The parcel had been sent by someone in Galway City, a cousin Michael surmised, based on the surname on the return address, who had apparently written the old address from memory or from a very old address book. The parcel was a tin of biscuits, which he could determine from the label and from the weight, and from the particular sound it made when he tilted it. Slightly. He wrote a note on official post office paper, the last of it that he had, explaining that Bridget Keneally had not lived at this address for some considerable time. He did not know where she lived now, or whether she still lived at all. He attached the note to the parcel and placed it in the outgoing mail, addressed to the sender in Galway. He thought about Bridget Keneally for the rest of the afternoon. He thought about where she might have gone in 1973. England, probably London, possibly Birmingham, possibly somewhere else entirely. He thought about what she might have made of a tin of biscuits arriving at a house she had not lived in for 50 years. Probably she would have found it touching, he thought, or possibly strange. Both, most likely. On Thursday, Nora came and Tomas Og came, and Michael made tea twice. Cara occupied her spot 14 inches to the left and tapped her tail in the particular rhythm that was hers alone. The conversation covered the weather forecast, the state of the road up to the old school, and a television program that 2 of the 3 of them had watched the previous evening. On Friday, Father Brendan came at his usual time and bought a stamp. He paused at the door on the way out and said that the evenings were drawing in, which they were. Michael agreed that they were. Father Brendan left. The door closed. That was the week. It was not an unusual week. There had been hundreds of weeks like it, and there would be more. That winter Michael wrote a letter that he did not send. He wrote it over 3 evenings, which was unusual for him. He was ordinarily a one-sitting letter writer, but this particular letter required more consideration than most. The letter was addressed to an post regarding the regulatory question that had not been resolved in 14 months, and which by this point had been unresolved for considerably longer. In the letter he described the situation clearly and in full, which took 4 pages. He described the history of the post office, its operating years, its formal closure proceedings, the oversight in the DS-11 form, his discovery of the oversight, and the subsequent reopening. He described the current situation, the regulars, the opening hours, the absence of mail delivery, the continued operation as an informal community resource. He did not ask for anything specific. He stated the situation and left the response, if any, to them. He read it over twice, made 2 small corrections, and then folded it and put it in an envelope. He addressed the envelope. He placed a stamp on it, one of his own, from the dispenser on the counter, and then he put it in the drawer of the kitchen table and did not take it out again. He was not sure why he had not sent it. He had said everything he wanted to say. The address was correct. The stamp was there. He thought about it for some weeks and arrived at the conclusion that he did not want the situation to be resolved, that whatever an post decided would change something that was currently working, and that he was not sure the change would be an improvement. The letter stayed in the drawer. The regulatory question remained unresolved. The post office remained open. The question of what would happen when Michael was no longer able to run the post office was one that several people had thought about, and none of them had raised with him directly. Nora had thought about it. She was 85 by this point, and was aware that questions of this kind applied to her own situation as much as to his. Suvan had thought about it and had concluded that she would probably help with something if asked, though she had not specified in her own mind what that something might be. Tomas Og had thought about it once and had found the thinking unproductive and had stopped. Father Brendan had thought about it in the way that a man who has spent 40 years thinking about endings tends to think about such things, which is to say carefully and without urgency. Michael himself had thought about it. He was 61. He was in good health, which he attributed in roughly equal parts to the walks, the sleep, and the genetics, with the genetics doing most of the work. He expected to run the post office for as long as he was able and to think about the alternative when it became necessary to think about it. He thought this was a reasonable approach. Most things in his experience resolved themselves when you gave them enough time. He was aware that not all things resolved themselves in satisfactory ways, but he considered this a separate question. The post office continued to open at 8:30 and close at 4:30. The radio played, the rubber bands occupied their ceramic pot. The spider plant occupied its windowsill. The oak counter held the weight of hands placed on it, which continued to be fewer than before, but which were also exactly the hands it was supposed to hold. In the 4th year, and Post wrote back, the letter was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged the situation as Michael had described it. The second paragraph noted that the DS-11 form had now been located and that the oversight had been recorded. The third paragraph stated that, given the community service function the premises had continued to provide, no further regulatory action would be taken at this time. He read the letter twice. He folded it once vertically. He put it in the folder under the counter with the others. At some point in the 5th year, Michael took the folder out from under the counter and looked at what was in it. The folder contained, in the order they had been placed there, the consultation letter, the formal closure decision, the newspaper clipping from the Galway Journalist, the academic paper by Dr. Aoife Brennan, and the An Post regulatory response. He had not counted them before and found the number smaller than he had expected. He read each one in the order he had placed it there, which was also the order in which things had happened. The consultation letter was shorter than he remembered. He had lived with its contents for long enough that he had expanded them in his memory beyond their actual length. The newspaper clipping had yellowed slightly at the edges, which seemed appropriate. Brennan's paper he read in full for the second time, and found that he remembered most of it correctly, and that the parts he had misremembered were the parts about himself. Brennan had described things accurately, which he considered the appropriate achievement for a piece of writing about a specific place. He put the documents back in the order he had taken them out, which was also the order they had arrived, and returned the folder to its place under the counter. The 5th year was in many ways the most settled of the reopened years. The regulars had developed habits within habits, small variations and subroutines that had solidified over time into their own kind of permanence. Nora had a particular way of placing her bag on the counter before speaking, left hand first, then right, then a small adjustment that she had been doing for as long as Michael could remember her coming in. He had noticed this, but had never mentioned it because it was not something that needed to be mentioned. Tomas Og had a habit of saying goodbye twice, once at the counter and once at the door, the second time as if he had remembered something he had meant to say and had not. He never did say the additional thing, or if he did, it was something small, and the second goodbye was complete in itself. Sophane Faherty had developed a habit of bringing a book to leave for Michael when she had finished with it, which had resulted in a small shelf of her recommendations behind the counter. He had read all of them. He had placed them in the order she had brought them, so the shelf was also a timeline. Father Brendan had stopped buying stamps in the 4th year. He still came on Fridays. He still paused at the door. He still counted time by the weather outside it. He simply no longer bought stamps, and neither of them mentioned it, and Michael did not know what it meant, and thought it might not mean anything. In the 5th year, Nora turned 87. She moved more slowly than she had in the 1st year of the reopening, which was to be expected, and which she acknowledged with the same practicality she brought to everything. She had developed a preference for sitting rather than standing at the counter, which Michael had accommodated by placing one of the chairs from the back room near the customer side. She had not asked for the chair. He had placed it there one Thursday, and she had sat in it, and nothing more had been said. Cara was 7 in the 5th year, which is not old for a dog of her size and type, but which was old enough that the tapping of her tail had become slightly less vigorous than it had been. Michael had noticed this. He had not mentioned it to Tomas Og, who he thought had also noticed it, and also not mentioned it, and who was managing the information in his own way. The post office itself had changed very little in 5 years. The rubber band pot was the same pot. The clock had been replaced once with an identical model because the first had stopped and could not be repaired. The replacement clock had a slightly different tick from the original, which Michael had noticed for approximately 3 weeks before his brain had accommodated it and filed it as normal. The pigeonholes had not changed. The 16 names were still there. 6 of those people still collected their mail. The other 10 had died or moved away or stopped receiving mail for reasons he did not always know. He had not removed the names of the 10. He was not sure why, except that the names had been there for a long time, and their removal would require a reason he had not yet identified. On a morning in November of the 5th year, he stood at the window and looked at the bay, as he always did, and thought, as he occasionally did, about the question of what the post office was now. It was not in any official sense a post office. There was no mail. There were no transactions of the kind a post office was designed to facilitate. It was a room with a counter and some pigeonholes and a sign above the door that had been there since 1923. It was a place where people came. It was a place where the same people had been coming for years, and where their coming had developed a weight that was distinct from the weight of any individual visit. It was a place where Kara had a spot on the quarry tiles, 14 inches to the left of her original spot, and where the shift had happened so gradually that no one could say when. It was a place where the light came in through the front window at a particular angle in October, that it did not come in any other month, and which Michael had noticed every October for 30 years. It was a place where things had been received and sent, which was Nora's description, and which remained the most accurate one he had encountered. He stood at the window for the usual 5 minutes, and then turned and went behind the counter and waited for who would come. The question of what the post office was could also be answered differently, he thought. It was a place that had stayed in a town where many things had not stayed. The pub, the hardware shop, the school, the lifeboat station in its active form. More than half the population the post office had stayed. Not always in the same form, not always for the same reasons. He found this a satisfying thing to think about on a November morning before the regulars came. There are, at the time of this case being filed, 9 people living in Carrow Bay, possibly 11 depending on the 2 brothers and whether their Connemara house has been completed, which as of the most recent information available to this record it has not. The post office is open. It opens at 8:30 and closes at 4:30 on days when there is reason to be open, which includes most days. There is no mail delivery. There have been no official postal transactions since the 31st of January of the year of closure. There is a rubber band dispenser in a ceramic pot that was originally a mustard jar. There's a clock. There is a radio. There is a spider plant on the windowsill that has been there for 16 years and which receives approximately the same amount of attention it has always received, which is not very much. There is an oak counter with a different grain at the far left end from years of the same hands resting there. There is a wooden bench on the customer side with the same characteristic grain at its left end for the same reason. There is a folder under the counter containing 5 documents. There are 16 pigeonholes with their original name cards. 6 are in active use. The other 10 are kept because their names have been there long enough that removing them requires a reason that has not yet presented itself. There is a postmaster. His name is Michael Folan. He has run this post office for 32 years. He opens it because it is open, and it is open because he opens it. There are 4 regulars. They come when they come. Their coming is the post office's purpose in its current form. The case as it stands is open. Filed under Forgotten keeps records of things that the larger record has not kept, or has kept imprecisely, or has kept in ways that miss what was specifically true about them. A post office in a town of 9 people that has been open in some form for over a century is a thing worth keeping a record of, not because it is exceptional, but because it is specific. The record that follows is not complete. No record of a living place is complete. It does not contain everything that happened in this post office. It does not contain the full content of the conversations, or the complete list of the letters sorted, or the names of the people who came before the 4 who come now. It does not contain the name of the dog that preceded Kara, which Michael knows was a black Labrador named Cillian, but which this record does not have space for. It does not contain what Father Brendan writes in his weekly letters, or where they go, or whether they are read. It does not contain the 40 years of mail that passed through the 16 pigeonholes before the closure, the individual objects, the weight of specific things received and sent. What this record contains is a shape, the shape of a place and the people in it over a specific period of time. Shapes are not the same as the things they describe, but they are better than nothing, and sometimes in the right light they are very close. The following is the last entry in this case. On the morning this case was closed for filing. The post office in Carrow Bay was open. The sign above the door read, "And Post." It had read this since 1923, through several sign paintings and one replacement of the timber board itself. The lettering each time returned to the same size and color as before. The front window was clean. Michael cleaned it on the last Friday of each month using a cloth and a spray he had been buying from the hardware shop in Clogmore for 11 years. The door was unlocked at 8:30. The sign was turned from closed to open. The radio was switched on. The particular station Michael preferred came on mid-sentence, as it always did, because he never turned it off at the dial. The rubber band pot occupied its position on the counter. It was approximately 1/3 full, which was its usual state. The spider plant was on the windowsill. It had produced 3 new shoots in the previous month, which Michael had not yet separated from the parent plant, and which he may or may not get. Round 2. The 16 pigeonholes were in their positions. 6 had mail in them. The other 10 had their names. The folder was under the counter. The 5 documents were inside it, in the order of their arrival. The oak counter held the morning light. At 9:23, Tomas Og arrived with Kara, who went directly to her spot on the tiles without looking to either side. Her tail tapped 7 times, then settled. Tomas Og said that it was cold out, which it was. Michael made tea. They talked about several things and nothing in particular. At 10:40, Nora arrived and sat in her chair on the customer side of the counter. She had brought, without being asked, a piece of apple tart wrapped in foil, which she placed on the counter and which Michael cut into 3 pieces, one of which he put on the floor for Kara. Kara ate her piece without particular ceremony, which was her way with food. Nora said she had made 2 of them and had not known what to do with the second. Michael said it was very good, which it was. At 11:50, Siobhan Faherty arrived with a book for the shelf and a letter to be posted to her daughter in Dublin. The book went on the shelf. The letter went into the outgoing mail. She had 3 things she wanted to tell Michael, which she told him, and which he listened to with the attention she had come to rely on, and which he gave to most things said to him in this room. He had no strong opinions on any of the 3 things which he said, which she appreciated. Father Brendan arrived at 12:30, which was later than his usual time, and which he did not explain. He sat on the bench. He was there for 40 minutes. He spoke about the weather and about a tree on the road to Clogmore that had come down in the last storm. He did not buy a stamp. He said goodbye at the counter and then again at the door, which was Tomas Og's habit and not his, and which surprised both of them slightly. No one mentioned it. By 2 o'clock all 4 had gone and the post office was quiet. Michael cleared the cups. He washed them at the sink in the back room. He returned the chair from the customer side to its position against the wall. He did not return it far enough. It ended up approximately 6 inches from the wall, where it had been for several months, and where it would stay. He read for an hour. He drank a second cup of tea that he made for himself. At 4:30 he closed the post office. He turned the sign from open to closed. He switched off the radio, which he did at the dial rather than at the socket, so that when he turned it on the next morning it would come on mid-sentence. He locked the front door. He went upstairs to the flat. The post office was dark. The spider plant on the windowsill caught the last light of the afternoon through the front glass. It would receive no further attention until Michael came down the next morning, passed it on his way to the counter, and noted that it was still there. The case number is Case001. It is the first case in this archive. It concerns a post office in a coastal village in County Galway, Ireland, population 9, possibly 11, that has been open in some form since 1923. The subject of this case is not the closure. The subject of this case is not the reopening. The subject of this case is the post office as it has existed before the closure, through it, and after it, as a place where people came. The record notes that on the morning of filing 4 people came, that a dog lay on quarry tiles and tapped her tail, that tea was made, that apple tart was shared, that a fallen tree was discussed. The record notes that the post office was open at 8:30 and closed at 4:30, as it has been on most days for over a century. The record notes that the spider plant is still there. The record is open.